Grace Kim had been teaching fitness at Galaxy Fitness Hub for 3 years, and she'd learned that every species in the galaxy had one thing in common. They all made excuses about why they couldn't exercise. The Regelians claimed their tentacles weren't designed for weightlifting. The Andromedans insisted their crystalline structure made cardio impossible, and the Zephyrians argued that their gaseous lower bodies couldn't handle squats. But in all her time training aliens from 47 different species, Grace had never encountered someone quite like THOSS. The old Cretarian shuffled into the gym on a Tuesday morning when Grace was setting up equipment for the senior citizens low-impact class. At first glance, he looked like a walking boulder 7 feet tall, covered in rough gray skin that resembled granite, with massive hands that could probably crush a barbell without trying. But there was something about the way he moved, hesitant and careful, that made Grace think of her elderly Korean grandfather trying to navigate a smartphone. "Excuse me," Thomas rumbled, his voice like distant thunder filtered through the gym's universal translator. "I am inquiring about exercise lessons." Grace looked up from the resistance bands she was arranging and smiled. "Of course. Are you interested in joining our senior fitness program? We have a great group that meets every Tuesday and Thursday." Thassa's massive head shook slowly. No, I require private instruction." "I am." He paused, his rocky features shifting into what Grace recognized as embarrassment across multiple species. "I am completely ignorant about physical fitness. At 847 years old, I have never engaged in intentional exercise." Grace blinked. In 3 years of training aliens, she'd worked with clients who were out of shape, clients who were recovering from injuries, and clients who thought exercise meant walking to the refrigerator. But she'd never met someone who had literally never exercised in their entire life, especially not someone who was over 8 centuries old. "Never?" she asked gently. "Cretarians traditionally achieve physical maintenance through our work in the stone quarries. We lift, we carry, we move heavy objects as part of our cultural occupation." Thassa's shoulders sagged, making him look like a mountain that had suddenly lost confidence in its own height. "But I was different. I became a scholar instead. I spent 800 years sitting in libraries, reading philosophy, writing treatises on ethical geology. My body has become weak." Grace had seen this look before, the mixture of shame and desperate hope that appeared on clients who felt like they'd let themselves down. It was the same expression her grandfather had worn when he'd asked her to teach him how to use email so he could stay in touch with his great-grandchildren. "Well," Grace said, clapping her hands together with the kind of enthusiasm that had made her the gym's most requested trainer, "it's never too late to start. What made you decide to try exercise now?" Thassa's rocky skin actually seemed to flush darker. "My great-great-granddaughter is getting bonded next month. The ceremony involves a traditional Cretarian strength ritual where family elders must lift ceremonial stones to bless the union." He looked down at his massive hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I attempted to practice last week and could barely lift stones that young Cretarians handle easily. I will embarrass my family if I cannot perform the ritual." Grace felt her heart do that thing it always did. When she realized a client's fitness goals weren't really about fitness at all. They were about connection, dignity, and being able to show up for the people they loved. "How heavy are these ceremonial stones?" she asked. "Approximately 200 human pounds each. The ritual requires lifting 3 stones simultaneously while reciting blessing poetry." Thomas demonstrated the motion, his massive arms moving in a complex pattern that looked like a combination of deadlifting and interpretive dance. "I managed 1 stone for approximately 30 seconds before my muscles failed completely." Grace watched his form, noting that despite never training, his natural Cretarian physiology gave him excellent leverage and a solid base. The problem wasn't that he couldn't do it, it was that 800 years of scholarly life had left his naturally powerful muscles completely unconditioned. "Thomas's, how long do we have until the bonding ceremony?" 6 weeks. Grace had transformed clients in 6 weeks before, but never someone who was starting from absolute zero at 847 years old. Most trainers would probably suggest he find a different way to participate in the ceremony. But Grace had learned something important about motivation during her years of training. When someone's goal was really about love for family, love for tradition, love for being able to contribute, they could accomplish things that seemed impossible. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, moving to stand directly in front of the massive alien. "How important is this bonding ceremony to you?" Thas's entire demeanor shifted, his rocky features softening. "Zara is my first great-great-granddaughter. Her parents died in a mining accident when she was young, so I helped raise her through her scholarly years. She chose to pursue engineering rather than follow traditional Kratarian paths, and our family worried she might never find a mate who appreciated her mind." He paused, and Grace could see genuine love and pride in his ancient eyes. "But she found Corvin a wonderful young Kratarian who values her intelligence and supports her dreams. Their bonding ceremony represents not just their love, but the successful blending of tradition with progress. As the family's senior scholar, I am supposed to represent wisdom and strength, blessing their union." Grace felt that familiar surge of determination that always came when she understood what really mattered to a client. This wasn't about lifting weights. It was about an old grandfather wanting to show his granddaughter that tradition and progress could work together. "Just like she and her engineer fiancé, Thomas's," Grace said, extending her hand toward the alien, who probably weighed 3 times as much as she did. "I'm going to help you lift those ceremonial stones. But I need to warn you, 6 weeks of training starting from zero is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Are you ready for that?" Thomas's looked down at Grace's small human hand, then slowly extended one massive finger to shake it as gently as possible. "Grace Kim, personal trainer, I have spent 847 years avoiding physical challenges because I believed I was not built for them. If you are willing to teach me, I am willing to learn." As Grace began explaining the basics of progressive resistance, training to an 847-year-old alien who had never done a push-up, she realized she was about to attempt something that would either be the most rewarding training experience of her career or a spectacular demonstration of why some goals are impossible. But looking at Thas's determined expression, Grace found herself thinking about her grandfather, who had learned to video chat at age 89 because he wanted to read bedtime stories to his great-grandchildren in Korea. Sometimes the most impossible goals were just love wearing a disguise. "All right, Thomases," Grace said, leading him toward the basic equipment area. "Let's start with the fundamentals. But I have to ask, what exactly is ethical geology?" For the first time since entering the gym, Thas's rocky features arranged themselves into what could generously be called a smile. "It is the philosophical study of how different species' relationships with planetary materials reflect their moral development. For example, humans use concrete to build structures that bring communities together, while Zephyrians manipulate crystal formations to create art that inspires emotional growth." Grace paused in her explanation of proper lifting posture. "That's actually fascinating. So you study how civilizations use rocks and minerals to express their values?" "Precisely. I have written 17 treatises on the correlation between architectural choices and societal ethics. My most famous work, The Moral Implications of Foundation Depth, is required reading in 3-star systems." Grace looked at this massive, scholarly alien who was afraid he couldn't lift ceremonial stones and suddenly understood something important. Thomas's wasn't weak. He was just strong in a completely different way than his culture traditionally valued. Her job wasn't to make him into a typical Kratarian. It was to help him discover that his kind of strength could lift stones too. "You know what, Thomases? I think we're going to get along just fine." The first week of training revealed that Grace had drastically underestimated the complexity of her challenge. It wasn't just that Thomas's had never exercised. It was that his entire relationship with his physical body was fundamentally different from any client she'd ever worked with. "I do not understand the purpose of this motion," Thomas's said, struggling with what should have been a simple bodyweight squat. His massive frame was perfectly capable of the movement, but he approached it with the same analytical detachment he might use to examine an interesting rock formation. "It's building strength in your legs and core," Grace explained for the 4th time. "The same muscles you'll need to lift the ceremonial stones." "But why must I perform this motion repeatedly without carrying actual stones? Would it not be more efficient to practice the exact ceremony movements?" This was the problem Grace was discovering. Thomas's approached exercise like a research project. He wanted to understand the theoretical framework, the historical precedents, and the optimal methodology before he was willing to trust the process. Every movement had to be justified intellectually before he could commit to it physically. Thomas's, sometimes you have to trust the process before you understand it completely. Grace said, demonstrating the squat again. Think of it like ... learning to read. You had to practice individual letters before you could write treatises on ethical geology. Thomas's considered this analogy while attempting another squat, his form improving slightly as he applied the metaphor. So these fundamental movements are the alphabet of physical strength. Exactly. And just like you couldn't write philosophy without mastering basic grammar, you can't perform the ceremonial lifting without building foundational strength. This seemed to satisfy Thassa's need for intellectual framework, and Grace felt a moment of triumph. But her satisfaction was short-lived when she realized they had a much bigger problem. Thassa's conditioning was worse than she'd initially assessed. After just 10 minutes of basic movements, the massive alien was breathing heavily, his rocky skin glistening with a mineral-based sweat that looked like morning dew on granite. Grace had trained elderly clients before, but Thassa's cardiovascular system seemed to have the endurance capacity of someone who had spent 8 centuries sitting perfectly still. We need to take this much slower, Grace said, leading Thomas's to a bench. Tell me about your daily routine. How much walking do you typically do? Walking? Thomas's seemed puzzled by the question. I travel from my dwelling to the library via transport pod. The library has automated movement platforms between floors. I suppose I walk approximately 50 steps per day. Grace stared at him. 50 steps? Perhaps fewer on days when I am deeply engaged in research. No wonder he was exhausted after 10 minutes of squats. Thomas's hadn't just avoided exercise. He'd created a lifestyle that eliminated almost all incidental physical activity. Grace had trained couch potatoes before, but Thomas's was operating at a level of inactivity that approached hibernation. Okay, we need to completely restructure our approach, Grace said, pulling out her tablet to revise the training plan she'd spent hours developing. Before we can even think about lifting ceremonial stones, we need to build your basic cardiovascular capacity and movement patterns. But as Grace began explaining a modified routine focused on walking and basic mobility, she noticed something concerning in Thassa's expression. The eager determination he'd shown on his first day was fading, replaced by the familiar look of a client who was beginning to doubt whether their goals were achievable. Grace Kim, personal trainer, Thomas said, formally, perhaps this endeavor is not practical. I am beginning to understand why Kratarians traditionally maintain fitness through quarry work from childhood. Attempting to develop physical capability at my age may be biologically impossible. Grace had seen this moment before, the point where a client's initial enthusiasm crashed into the reality of how much work would be required. It was the moment that separated the people who would achieve their goals from the people who would give up and make excuses. Thomas's, can I tell you about my grandfather? The alien looked puzzled by the apparent topic change, but nodded. My grandfather was a traditional Korean man who believed technology was for young people. At 89, he had never used a computer, never sent an email, never video chatted. But when my cousin moved to Seoul for work and had a baby, my grandfather decided he wanted to read bedtime stories to his great-granddaughter every night. Grace sat down on the bench next to Thomas's, remembering her grandfather's frustrated attempts to navigate video calling software. It took him 4 months to learn how to turn on the computer, another 3 months to figure out email. By the time he mastered video chatting, he was 90 years old. But you know what? For the last 5 years of his life, he read bedtime stories to kids in 3 different countries every single night. Thassa's rocky features had settled into an expression of thoughtful attention. The point is, my grandfather didn't learn technology because it was easy, or because he was naturally good at it, or because he had plenty of time. He learned it because reading to his great-granddaughter was more important than being comfortable. Grace stood up and faced Thomas's directly. You're not trying to become a professional athlete. You're not trying to win competitions or impress strangers. You're trying to lift 3 stones for 1 ceremony. so you can bless your granddaughter's bonding. That's it. That's the whole goal. Thomas's was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying Grace with the intensity he probably brought to analyzing geological formations. You believe this is achievable? I believe that if you're willing to do the work, even when it's boring, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, we can get you strong enough to perform that ritual. And if we cannot, Grace had learned never to promise clients outcomes she couldn't guarantee. But she'd also learned that sometimes people needed to hear someone believe in them before they could believe in themselves. Ben will figure out a way to modify the ritual so you can participate meaningfully. But Thomas's, I've seen what happens when people are motivated by love instead of vanity. They achieve things that seem impossible. Thomas's stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across the gym equipment. Very well, Grace Kim. I will trust your expertise, even when I do not understand your methods. Good, because we're going to start with something that might seem completely ridiculous. Grace led Thomas's to the far corner of the gym, where a collection of colorful foam blocks and resistance bands looked more like children's toys than serious exercise equipment. These are the tools we're going to use to rebuild your movement patterns from the ground up. I want you to think of this as constructing a philosophical argument. You can't jump to the conclusion. You have to build the foundation, develop the supporting points, and structure the logical framework. This analogy seemed to resonate with Thomas's in a way that traditional fitness motivation never could. His posture straightened, and Grace could see him applying his scholarly mindset to the physical challenge. So these basic movements are the premises from which we will construct the argument for ceremonial stone lifting? Exactly. And just like a philosophical argument, every component has to be solid before you can build on top of it. As Grace began teaching Thomas's how to properly hinge at his hips using a resistance band, a movement so basic that most humans learned it as toddlers, she realized they were embarking on something unprecedented. She wasn't just training an elderly client. She was teaching an alien scholar how to inhabit his own body as a learning tool. But she was also discovering that Thomas's scholarly approach to physical training, while initially frustrating, might actually be his greatest strength. He brought the same methodical attention to detail to exercise that he brought to studying rocks. Once he understood the framework, he committed to it with the dedication of someone who had spent 8 centuries mastering complex subjects. Grace Kim, Thomas said as they finished the session, I have a question about our training methodology. What's that? In your grandfather's story, did he ever become truly proficient with technology? Or did he simply become adequate enough to achieve his specific goal? Grace smiled, recognizing that Thomas's was already thinking strategically about their approach. He became exactly as good as he needed to be to read bedtime stories every night for 5 years. Not more, not less. Excellent. Then our objective is not to make me into an ideal Crotarian physical specimen, but to develop precisely the capabilities required for the ceremonial ritual. Now you're getting it. As Grace watched Thomas's carefully pack up the foam blocks they'd been using, treating them with the same respect he'd probably show ancient geological specimens, she realized that their biggest challenge wasn't going to be building his physical strength. It was going to be helping him understand that sometimes the most important achievements aren't the ones that look impressive to other people. Sometimes they're just about showing up with love, doing your best, and trusting that your effort matters more than your performance. But first, they had to get him strong enough to lift 200 pounds 3 times while reciting poetry. Grace was starting to think her grandfather's technology challenge had been easier. 3 weeks into their training, Grace discovered that working with Thomas's was like having a conversation between 2 completely different philosophies of existence. She represented the human belief that bodies were meant to move, challenge themselves, and adapt. He embodied the Crotarian scholarly tradition that minds were meant to think, analyze, and understand. But somewhere in the middle of their daily sessions, something unexpected was happening. They were both learning to see the world through each other's perspective. I have been observing the other gym members, Thomas's said during their Thursday morning session, carefully performing the hip hinge movement that had taken him 2 weeks to master. The Rigelian in the corner appears to be lifting metal objects, repeatedly with no practical purpose. Is this normal human behavior? Grace looked over at Blix, a regular client who came in every Tuesday and Thursday to work on his tentacle strength. He's training for a powerlifting competition. It's a sport where people compete to see who can lift the heaviest weights. Thomas's paused mid-movement, his rocky features arranged in an expression of scholarly puzzlement. They compete to perform labor tasks? This seems inefficient. Why not simply compete to complete actual work that benefits society? It's not about efficiency, Thomases. It's about pushing your body to see what it's capable of, testing your limits, achieving personal growth through challenge. Ah, Thomases said, resuming his hip hinges with improved form. So it is a form of applied philosophy. They use physical stress to explore the boundaries of personal potential. Grace had never thought of powerlifting as applied philosophy, but Thomas's interpretation actually made perfect sense. That single quotes actually a really insightful way to look at it. Physical training appears to be more intellectually complex than I initially assessed. You humans use exercise as a method of self-discovery. This was what Grace was discovering about Thomas's. Once he understood the conceptual framework behind something, he approached it with the thoroughness and curiosity that had made him a renowned scholar. But more than that, his questions were forcing her to think about fitness in ways she'd never considered. Thomas's, can I ask you something? What made you choose ethical geology as your field of study? Thomas's carefully completed his set of hip hinges before answering, his movement now smooth and controlled after weeks of practice. I became fascinated by the idea that every species' relationship with planetary materials reveals something fundamental about their values and worldview. He moved to the resistance band exercises Grace had prescribed, his massive hands surprisingly gentle with the equipment. For example, humans use concrete and steel to build structures that bring communities together: apartment buildings, schools, hospitals. This suggests that your species values collective shelter and shared resources. But Zephyrians manipulate crystal formations to create art installations that inspire individual emotional experiences. This indicates a cultural priority for personal, spiritual development. Grace found herself completely absorbed in Thomas's explanation, momentarily forgetting to count his repetitions. Kratarians traditionally carve living stone to create multi-generational family dwellings that expand as the family grows. Our architecture reflects our belief that permanence and family continuity are the highest values. Thomas's voice carried a note of pride that Grace hadn't heard before. But I realized that my generation's move away from quarry work towards scholarly pursuits might represent an evolution in our cultural values. How so? By choosing to build knowledge rather than buildings, scholars like myself are prioritizing intellectual permanence over physical permanence. My treatises on ethical geology will outlast any stone dwelling. Grace watched Thomas's perform his exercises with increasing confidence, noting that his form was improving, not just because of physical practice, but because he'd found intellectual meaning in the movements. That's incredible, Thomas's. So your work is really about understanding how different species express their deepest beliefs through the way they interact with their environment. Precisely. And now, I am discovering that exercise is another form of environmental interaction. Humans use physical challenge as a way to explore and express personal values. This insight led to what Grace would later remember as the breakthrough moment in their training relationship. Instead of seeing exercise as a departure from his scholarly work, Thomas's began to understand it as an extension of his research into how different species approached growth and development. Grace Kim, I have a hypothesis about our training methodology. I'd love to hear it. You are teaching me to treat my body as I would treat a research subject, with patience, systematic observation, and gradual development of understanding. The progressive overload principle is essentially the same as the incremental learning process I use to master complex philosophical concepts. Grace paused in her demonstration of the next exercise. Thomas's had just articulated something about training theory that most fitness professionals never explicitly recognized. That's exactly right. You can't understand advanced philosophy without mastering basic concepts first. And you can't perform complex movements without developing fundamental strength patterns. And just as I would not expect to comprehend a difficult text on my first reading, I should not expect my body to master challenging movements without adequate preparation. Thomas's, you just described progressive overload better than most textbooks I've read. For the first time since they'd started training, Thassa's rocky features arranged themselves into what was unmistakably a smile. Perhaps my scholarly approach to physical development is not as inefficient as I initially believed, but it was during their 4th week of training that Grace discovered the real reason Thomas's was so committed to the ceremonial ritual, and it changed everything about how she understood their work together. Can I tell you about Zara? Thomas's asked during their rest period between sets. Of course. She was 7 years old when her parents died in the mining accident. Standard Kratarian practice would have been to place her with relatives who worked in the quarries, where she could learn traditional stone carving and eventually find a mate within the established cultural framework. Thassa's voice carried a weight of memory that made Grace set down her training notes and give him her full attention. But Zara was different. She was fascinated by the mechanical equipment used in the mines. While other young Kratarians learned to shape stone with their hands, she wanted to understand how the machines worked, how they could be improved, how technology could make dangerous work safer. Grace could hear the pride and concern mixing in Thassa's voice. Her relatives considered this interest inappropriate. They believed she was rejecting Kratarian values, abandoning her cultural identity. But I saw something else. I saw a young mind applying Kratarian principles of craftsmanship and improvement to new materials and methods. So you took her in? I became her guardian and advocate. I argued that her engineering interests represented an evolution of traditional Kratarian values rather than a rejection of them. Stone carving requires understanding material properties, structural integrity, and functional design. Engineering simply applies these same principles to different materials and larger-scale projects. Thomas's moved to his next exercise, but Grace could see that his physical movements were now connected to something much deeper than muscle development. But supporting her education meant challenging our cultural norms. Many Kratarians viewed my advocacy for her non-traditional path as evidence that scholarly life had made me disconnected from our essential values. And now Zara is a respected engineer who has designed safer mining equipment that has prevented dozens of accidents, like the one that killed her parents. She has found a mate who values her mind and supports her work, and she has requested that I perform the traditional blessing ritual at her bonding ceremony. Grace felt the full weight of what this ceremony meant to Thomas's. It wasn't just about lifting stones. It was about proving to his community that his non-traditional choices had been guided by authentic Kratarian values all along. Thomas's, you're not just lifting ceremonial stones. You're demonstrating that strength can take different forms, and that supporting someone's individual path is actually the most traditional thing you can do. Yes, Thomas's said quietly, and if I cannot perform the ritual adequately, I will be, confirming their belief that scholarly life has made me weak and disconnected from our essential nature. Grace looked at this massive, gentle alien who had spent 800 years studying the moral implications of how different species built their homes, who had sacrificed his own cultural standing to support his granddaughter's dreams, who was now pushing his ancient body through daily physical challenges because love mattered more than comfort. Thomas's, I need you to know something. In 4 weeks of training, you've gone from barely being able to perform a bodyweight squat to deadlifting 150 pounds with perfect form. Your cardiovascular capacity has improved by 300%. You're not the same person who walked into this gym. But is it sufficient? Grace had been wondering the same thing. The ceremonial ritual required lifting 600 pounds total 3 stones of 200 pounds, each while maintaining balance and reciting blessing poetry. Thassa's current maximum deadlift was 150 pounds, and that was under controlled gym conditions, with optimal grip and positioning. I don't know yet, Grace said honestly, but I know that every day you show up here, you're proving that strength isn't just about how much weight you can lift. It's about how willing you are to grow, to challenge yourself, to do hard things because they matter to people you love. Thomas's was quiet for a long moment, processing Grace's words with the careful consideration he brought to all complex ideas. Grace, Kim, I have learned something unexpected during our training. What's that? I began this process believing that physical strength and intellectual strength were fundamentally different qualities. But I am discovering that they require the same essential characteristics: patience with gradual progress, willingness to work through discomfort, commitment to consistent practice, and faith in improvement that cannot yet be measured. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. In all her years of training clients, she'd never had someone articulate the deeper meaning of fitness so perfectly. The most important thing I've learned from you, Thomas, is that every person's strength looks different, but it all comes from the same place, caring about something more than your own comfort. As they finished their session, Grace realized that their training relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected. She wasn't just teaching Thomas to lift weights. She was learning about the philosophical foundations of human resilience. He wasn't just building physical strength. He was discovering that his scholarly approach to life was actually a form of applied courage. But they still had 2 weeks to prepare for a ritual that would require Thomas's to lift more weight than he'd ever attempted in front of his entire extended family. While reciting traditional poetry, Grace was starting to understand that success might not be measured in pounds lifted, but in the courage to try. With 10 days remaining until the bonding ceremony, Grace faced the most challenging moment of her training career. Thomas's had progressed remarkably. His deadlift had reached 175 pounds. His cardiovascular endurance had improved dramatically, and his movement patterns were now smooth and controlled. But the ceremonial ritual required lifting 600 pounds total, while reciting blessing poetry, and Grace was beginning to doubt whether they could bridge the remaining gap. The doubt became a crisis during their Tuesday morning session, when Thomas attempted his first practice run of the actual ceremonial movements. Grace had constructed a simulation using 3 weighted sandbags of 175 pounds, each the maximum load Thomas could currently handle for a single lift. The ritual required him to lift all 3 simultaneously in a specific pattern, one in each hand and one held against his chest, while maintaining perfect balance and reciting traditional Qatarian poetry about strength, wisdom, and family continuity. Thomas approached the setup with the careful preparation he brought to all challenging tasks. He positioned his feet according to Grace's instructions, engaged his core muscles as they practiced, and began the complex lifting motion. For a moment, Grace thought they might actually succeed. Thomas managed to lift all 3 bags simultaneously, his massive frame handling the weight with the controlled power they'd been developing over 5 weeks of training. But as he attempted to recite the first line of blessing poetry, "From stone we come, to stone we return, but love makes us eternal," his grip began to fail. The sandbag held against his chest slipped first, throwing off his balance. The bags in his hands followed moments later, and Thomas stumbled backward, barely avoiding a fall that could have injured his aging joints. Grace rushed to help him regain his balance, but the damage was already done. She could see the familiar look of defeated resignation spreading across Thas's rocky features. "It is insufficient," he said quietly, staring down at the scattered sandbags. "Even with your excellent instruction, my physical capabilities are inadequate for the ceremonial requirements." Thomas's. "That was our first attempt at the complete movement pattern. We knew it would be challenging. Grace Kim, I appreciate your encouragement, but we must be realistic about the limitations of my aged physiology." Thas's voice carried the weight of someone who was trying to accept disappointment gracefully. "Perhaps I should contact Zara and explain that I will not be able to perform the traditional blessing." Grace felt something fierce and protective surge in her chest. She'd seen Thomas's transform over 5 weeks from someone who could barely walk 50 steps without getting winded to an alien who could deadlift 175 pounds with perfect form. She'd watched him approach every challenge with scholarly dedication, pushing through discomfort and confusion because his love for Zara mattered more than his comfort. "Absolutely not," Grace said firmly. "We're not giving up with 10 days left. But the mathematics are clear. I require the strength to lift approximately 125 additional pounds while maintaining complex movement, patterns, and cognitive function for poetry recitation. This represents a 35% increase in my current maximum capacity." Thomas's "Sit down," I need to tell you something. Grace led the discouraged alien to the bench, where they'd had so many conversations about training philosophy and family love. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a video she'd saved months ago, but never shared with clients. "This is footage of my grandfather's 91st birthday," she said, angling the screen so Thomases could see. "Watch what happens when he tries to video chat with my cousin in Seoul." The video showed Grace's elderly grandfather struggling with the technology that had once seemed impossible to him. His arthritic fingers moved slowly across the tablet screen. His face scrunched in concentration as he navigated the interface that had become second nature after years of practice. "He looks very focused," Thomases observed. "Keep watching." After several minutes of careful navigation, the call connected, and suddenly the screen filled with Grace's cousin and her young daughter. The little girl's face lit up when she saw her great-grandfather, and she immediately launched into an excited story about her day at school. Grace watched Thomas's expression as her grandfather's face transformed from concentrated effort to pure joy. The old man began reading a bedtime story in Korean, his voice gaining strength and warmth as he performed the ritual that had motivated him to master technology in his final years. "Grace Kim," Thomases said softly, "your grandfather appears to have found strength for the task that exceeded his apparent physical limitations. That's exactly what I want you to understand. When my grandfather was learning to use that tablet, he dropped it dozens of times. His hands shook. His eyes couldn't focus on the small text. His memory couldn't retain all the steps. But when he was actually reading to his great-granddaughter, all those limitations seemed to disappear." Grace put her phone away and faced Thomases directly. "I've been training people for 7 years, and I've learned something important about human potential. We're all stronger than we think we are, but we can only access that strength when we're doing something that matters more than our fear of failure." Thomases considered this insight with the careful attention he brought to all complex philosophical concepts. "You suggest that emotional motivation can temporarily enhance physical capabilities beyond normal parameters." "I'm saying that love makes us capable of things we never thought possible, not through magic or wishful thinking, but because when we're focused on serving someone else, we stop limiting ourselves with self-doubt." Grace stood up and began rearranging the sandbags they'd been using for practice. "Thomases, we're going to change our training approach for the final 10 days. Instead of focusing on building maximum strength, we're going to focus on building ceremonial strength." "I do not understand the distinction." "Maximum strength is what you can lift under perfect conditions in a gym with ideal equipment and no pressure. Ceremonial strength is what you can lift when you're standing in front of your family, thinking about Zara's happiness, focused on blessing her future instead of worrying about your performance." Grace positioned the sandbags in the ritual configuration. "We're going to practice the complete ceremony every day. Not to build your muscles, we've done that, but to build your confidence in performing under pressure, to practice accessing your strength when it matters most. And if my physical capabilities are truly insufficient, then we'll modify the ritual in a way that honors the tradition while acknowledging your unique circumstances." "But Thomases, I don't think that's going to be necessary." Grace began setting up what she privately called pressure training, practicing the ceremonial movements under conditions that simulated the emotional intensity of the actual ceremony. "For the next 10 days, we're going to practice the ritual while you're tired, while you're nervous, while I'm asking you questions about Zara and your family. We're going to build your ability to access your strength when your mind is focused on blessing rather than performing." Over the next week, Grace watched Thomases develop what she could only describe as ceremonial confidence. His maximum lift capacity hadn't increased dramatically, but his ability to perform under pressure improved remarkably. When he focused on reciting the blessing poetry, thinking about Zara's happiness rather than the weight in his hands, he lifted with a fluidity and power that seemed to exceed his measured capabilities. But 3 days before the ceremony, their progress was threatened by an unexpected complication. Corvin, Zara's fiancé, visited the gym to observe Thomas's training. Grace had been expecting family members to show interest in the older Criterian's preparation, but she hadn't anticipated the complex family dynamics that Corvin's presence would reveal. "Great-great-grandfather Thomases," Corvin said formally, his younger Quatarian physique making him appear significantly more powerful than the elderly scholar. I have come to assess your preparation for the ceremonial blessing. Grace immediately sensed tension in the interaction. Corvin's tone was respectful, but carried an undercurrent of concern that made Thas's posture stiffen with anxiety. I am training diligently, Thomas's replied, but Grace could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The family elders have expressed concern about your ability to perform the traditional ritual. They have suggested that perhaps I should assume the blessing responsibilities, as I am physically capable and have maintained traditional Crotarian strength through construction work. Grace felt her protective instincts surge. She'd watched Thomas's push through 5 weeks of challenging training, driven by his love for Zara and his desire to maintain his role in the family tradition. With respect, Corvin, Grace interjected, Thomas's has made remarkable progress in his physical preparation. Perhaps you'd like to observe his current capabilities. What followed was one of the most emotionally charged training sessions Grace had ever conducted. With Corvin watching critically, Thomas's attempted the ceremonial ritual with 175-pound sandbags, 25 pounds, less than the traditional requirement, but close enough to demonstrate his competence. Grace watched Thas's performance with growing pride and concern. His form was excellent, his breathing controlled, and he managed to recite the entire blessing poetry while maintaining the complex lifting position. But she could see the strain in his movements and knew that the additional 25 pounds would push him to his absolute limit. More importantly, she could see that Corvin remained skeptical. Great-great-grandfather, your effort is admirable, but the traditional stones weigh significantly more than these practice weights. Perhaps it would be wiser to allow me to perform the blessing while you participate in a different capacity. Thomas's set down the sandbags carefully, his rocky features showing the exhaustion that intense physical effort caused his aging body. Corvin, I understand your concern for the family's ceremonial traditions. It is not just tradition, great-great-grandfather. It is about ensuring that Zara's bonding ceremony proceeds smoothly without the risk of complications. Grace realized that Corvin wasn't just concerned about Thas's physical capabilities. He was worried about the potential embarrassment if the elderly scholar failed publicly during the ceremony. Corvin, Grace said, choosing her words carefully, I've been training people for 7 years, and I've learned that strength isn't just about maximum lifting capacity. It's about the ability to perform when performance matters most. But what if he cannot lift the ceremonial stones? Grace looked at Thomas's, seeing the weight of family expectations and self-doubt settling on his massive shoulders. This was the moment that would either strengthen his resolve or convince him to accept a diminished role in Zara's ceremony. Then we'll figure out an alternative that honors both tradition and reality, Grace said. But I believe Thomas's is going to surprise everyone with what he's capable of when he's focused on blessing Zara rather than proving his strength. Corvin studied both Grace and Thomas's with the careful assessment of someone who is trying to balance respect for elders with practical concerns about family ceremonies. Very well, I will defer to great-great-grandfather's preparation, but I will remain available as an alternative if needed. After Corvin left, Grace found Thomas's sitting quietly on their usual bench, staring at his massive hands as if trying to assess whether they contained sufficient strength for the task ahead. Thomas's, how are you feeling about the ceremony now? Uncertain, he admitted. Corvin's concerns are logical. I am attempting something that may be beyond my physical capabilities, and failure would affect not just my own dignity, but Zara's important day. Grace sat down beside him, thinking about her grandfather's determination to read bedtime stories despite technological challenges that seemed insurmountable. Thomas's, can I ask you something? What's the worst thing that could happen if you attempt the ritual and can't complete it perfectly? Thomas's considered the question with his characteristic thoroughness. I would demonstrate publicly that scholarly life has made me weak and disconnected from essential Crotarian values. Corvin would need to intervene, which would emphasize my inadequacy. The family would have their concerns about my non-traditional choices confirmed. And what's the best thing that could happen if you attempt it and succeed? I would demonstrate that strength takes many forms, that supporting individual growth is consistent with traditional values, and that love provides capabilities that transcend apparent limitations. Grace nodded. And what happens if you don't try at all? I avoid the risk of public failure, but I also forfeit the opportunity to show Zara and the family that her unconventional path has been blessed by someone who values both tradition and progress. Thomas's was quiet for a long minute, processing the decision matrix he'd constructed around this ceremonial challenge. Grace Kim, I believe I understand why you have been so committed to this training process. You see the ritual not as a physical test, but as an opportunity for me to demonstrate the values I have tried to embody throughout my support of Zara's education. Exactly. This ceremony isn't really about lifting stones. It's about showing your family that love and tradition can work together. That supporting someone's individual path is actually the most traditional thing you can do. And if I cannot lift the full ceremonial weight, then you'll lift what you can with perfect form and complete commitment, while reciting blessings that come from 847 years of wisdom and love. And that will be enough, because the strength they'll see won't be in your muscles. It'll be in your willingness to try. As they prepared to leave the gym, Grace realized that their training had evolved far beyond physical preparation. They were now preparing for a moment that would define not just Thassa's relationship with his family, but his understanding of his own capabilities and worth. 3 days remained until the bonding ceremony, and Grace found herself hoping that love would indeed prove stronger than doubt. The morning of Zara's bonding ceremony arrived with the kind of clear, bright weather that made everything seem possible. Grace had arranged to meet Thomas's at the ceremonial site 2 hours before the ritual to conduct one final practice session. But when she arrived at the traditional Kratarian gathering space, she found him sitting alone among the ancient stone formations, staring at the 3 ceremonial stones that would determine the success of 6 weeks of training. Grace Kim, Thomas said without looking up, I have been contemplating the mathematical probability of successful performance. Grace approached cautiously, recognizing the tone of someone who had spent too much time analyzing rather than preparing. And what did you conclude? The ceremonial stones weigh precisely 200 pounds each, as tradition requires. My maximum verified lift capacity is 175 pounds under optimal conditions. The additional 25 pounds per stone, combined with the complex positioning required for simultaneous lifting and the cognitive demands of poetry recitation, suggest a significant probability of failure. Grace sat down beside Thomas's on the weathered stone bench, noting that his usual scholarly calm had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone facing their most important test. Thomas's, do you remember what you told me about ethical geology on our first day of training? I said that different species' relationships with planetary materials reveal their fundamental values and worldview. Right. And what do you think these ceremonial stones reveal about Kratarian values? Thomas's looked at the 3 massive stones, each carved with intricate patterns that represented different aspects of family blessing strength, wisdom, and continuity. They represent our belief that family traditions require physical commitment, that blessings have weight and substance, that love must be demonstrated through challenging action rather than mere words. Exactly. So this ritual isn't really about how much you can lift. It's about your willingness to commit your full effort to blessing Zara's future, regardless of whether your performance looks perfect to observers. Grace stood up and walked to the ceremonial stones, running her hands over their carved surfaces. Thomas's, I want to try something different for our final practice session. What do you propose? Instead of practicing with the goal of lifting all 3 stones perfectly, I want you to practice with the goal of giving Zara the most meaningful blessing possible, using whatever strength you have available. Grace positioned herself beside the stones and demonstrated a modified version of the ritual positioning. Instead of the traditional stance that required lifting all 3 stones simultaneously, she showed Thomas's how he could lift 2 stones to their full height while keeping the third partially elevated, maintaining the essential elements of the ceremony while acknowledging his physical limitations. This modification preserves the symbolic meaning while adapting to your current capabilities, she explained. You're still demonstrating commitment, strength, and blessing. You're just doing it in a way that honors both tradition and reality. Thomas's approached the modified setup with the careful consideration he brought to all complex challenges. As he positioned his hands on the ceremonial stones, Grace could see him applying everything they practiced over 6 weeks of training: proper form, controlled breathing, core engagement, and most importantly, focus on the meaning behind this movement rather than anxiety about perfect performance. From stone we come, to stone we return, Thomas's began, his deep voice carrying the traditional blessing as he lifted 2 of the ceremonial stones to their full height while maintaining partial elevation on the third. But love makes us eternal. Grace watched in amazement as Thomas's continued through the complete ritual, his voice growing stronger and more confident as he progressed through the traditional poetry. His physical form wasn't perfect. The modified positioning was clearly demanding significant effort, but his presence and commitment were undeniable. Through strength we build, through wisdom we guide, through continuity we endure, he continued, holding the challenging position while his voice filled the ceremonial space with words that carried 847 years of life experience. May this bonding create strength that builds communities, wisdom that guides future generations, and love that endures beyond the boundaries of time and space. As Thomas's completed the final lines of the blessing and carefully lowered the ceremonial stones, Grace realized that something profound had just occurred. He hadn't lifted the traditional weight in the traditional manner, but he had delivered the most powerful ceremonial blessing she had ever witnessed. Thomas's, that was perfect, but I did not achieve the full traditional positioning. The third stone remained partially lowered throughout the recitation, and the blessing was still complete, authentic, and deeply meaningful. Anyone who witnesses that performance will understand that you've given everything you have to honor Zara's bonding. 2 hours later, Grace stood among the assembled Kratarian family members as Thomas's prepared to perform the actual ceremonial blessing. The gathering space was filled with aliens of all ages, from ancient elders whose rocky skin had weathered centuries of experience to young Kratarians who represented the future of their species. Zara stood beside Corvin at the center of the ceremonial circle, her engineered modifications to traditional Kratarian dress reflecting the successful blend of innovation and tradition that had defined her relationship with Thomas's. Her eyes were fixed on her great-great-grandfather with an expression of love and confidence that suggested she understood the significance of his willingness to attempt the ritual. Grace found herself holding her breath as Thomas's approached the ceremonial stones. She could see family members whispering among themselves, and she caught fragments of conversation that suggested not everyone was confident in the elderly scholar's ability to complete the traditional blessing. But as Thomas's positioned himself among the ceremonial stones and began to speak, something remarkable happened. His voice carried across the gathering space with an authority and warmth that commanded immediate attention from every family member present. From stone we come, to stone we return, but love makes us eternal. Grace watched as Thomas's lifted 2 of the ceremonial stones to their full height while maintaining the modified position they had practiced. His form was perfect, his voice steady and strong, and his commitment to the blessing was evident in every aspect of his performance. Through strength we build, through wisdom we guide, through continuity we endure. The family members who had been whispering fell completely silent as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a physical demonstration of strength. It was a scholarly elder using his entire life experience to bless the next generation's unconventional path. May this bonding create strength that builds communities, wisdom that guides future generations, and love that endures beyond the boundaries of time and space. As Thomas's held the challenging position through the final lines of the blessing poetry, Grace could see tears in the eyes of family members who had initially doubted his ability to contribute meaningfully to the ceremony. His performance wasn't traditional in its execution, but it was powerfully authentic in its commitment and love. When Thomas's completed the blessing and carefully lowered the ceremonial stones, the gathering space erupted in the harmonic chanting that represented the highest form of approval in Kratarian culture. Family members of all ages joined their voices in a sound that seemed to resonate with the ancient stone formations surrounding the ceremonial site. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Zara approach her great-great-grandfather. with arms extended for the traditional post-blessing embrace. Great-great-grandfather, Zara said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet gathering space. That was the most beautiful blessing I have ever heard. Thank you for showing our family that strength and wisdom can take many forms. As the ceremony continued with the traditional bonding rituals, Grace found herself approached by several family members who wanted to understand how Thomas had prepared for his performance. Grace Kim, human personal trainer, said an elderly Crotarian who introduced herself as Zara's great-aunt. We observed that Thas's ceremonial performance was modified from traditional positioning, but the result was more meaningful than any blessing we have previously witnessed. How did you prepare him for this achievement? Grace looked across the gathering space to where Thomas was surrounded by family members, all of them eager to congratulate him on his successful blessing and to hear stories about his training experience. I didn't really prepare him, Grace said. Honestly, I just helped him discover that he already had everything he needed. The strength to lift the stones came from his love for Zara. The wisdom in his blessing came from 847 years of studying how different species express their values. And the courage to attempt the ritual came from his commitment to supporting her unconventional path. Grace paused, watching Thomas's demonstrate some of the basic exercises they had practiced to a group of younger Kratarians who seemed fascinated by the idea that physical strength could be developed at any age. The most important thing I learned from training Thomas's is that every person already contains the capabilities they need to achieve what matters most to them. Sometimes they just need help discovering how to access those capabilities when it counts. As the bonding ceremony concluded, and family members began sharing traditional foods and stories, Grace realized that her 6 weeks of training an 847-year-old alien scholar had taught her something profound about the nature of human potential. Strength wasn't just about how much weight someone could lift. It was about how willing they were to grow, to challenge themselves, to do difficult things, because love demanded more than comfort. And sometimes, the most impossible goals were just opportunities for people to discover that they were stronger than they ever imagined. 6 months after Zara's bonding ceremony, Grace Kim had become something she never expected, the galaxy's first specialist in adaptive ceremonial training. Word of Thas's successful blessing ritual had spread throughout the Kratarian community and beyond, leading to requests from clients who needed to prepare for traditional ceremonies that their modern lifestyles had left them unequipped to handle. But more importantly, her training philosophy had evolved in ways that surprised even her. The thing about Thomas's, Grace explained to her newest client, a young Andromedan who needed to prepare for his species' traditional crystal-shaping coming-of-age ritual, is that he taught me the difference between training for performance and training for meaning. The Andromedan, whose crystalline structure had been weakened by years of sedentary academic work, listened intently as Grace explained her approach to ceremonial preparation. Traditional fitness training focuses on maximizing physical capabilities under ideal conditions, but ceremonial training focuses on accessing whatever capabilities you have when it matters most, when you're nervous, when people are watching, when the outcome represents something much more important than just lifting weight or performing movements. This distinction had become the foundation of Grace's new training methodology, which she had officially named Applied Strength Philosophy, in honor of Thas's scholarly influence on her understanding of physical development. Grace Kim, her Andromedan client, said, I am curious about something. How did you determine that modified ceremonial positioning would be acceptable for your Kratarian client? I didn't determine it, we discovered it together. The key insight was that ceremonies are about demonstrating commitment and love, not about perfect technical execution. As long as the essential meaning is preserved, the specific form can be adapted to individual capabilities. Grace led her client through the basic movement patterns they would need for crystal shaping preparation, noting how his scholarly background created the same analytical approach to physical training that she had observed with Thomas's. But more importantly, Thomas's taught me that every client already has the strength they need for what matters most to them. My job isn't to create capabilities that don't exist. It's to help people access the capabilities they already have when they're focused on serving others rather than impressing observers. The impact of this philosophy had extended far beyond Grace's individual training practice. Galaxy Fitness Hub had implemented ceremonial preparation as a specialized service, and Grace had been invited to speak at fitness conferences throughout 3-star systems about her approach to adaptive training. But the most meaningful change had been in her relationship with Thomas himself, who had become both a friend and an informal collaborator in her evolving understanding of strength and purpose. Grace Kim, Thomas said during one of their regular coffee meetings at the Jin's Cafe, "I have been reflecting on our training experience, and I believe we discovered something significant about the nature of achievement." What's that? Traditional approaches to challenging goals assume that success requires developing new capabilities that we currently lack. But our experience demonstrated that success often requires accessing existing capabilities under conditions where we are motivated by service to others rather than anxiety about personal performance. Thomas's had continued training after Zara's ceremony, not because he needed to prepare for additional rituals, but because he had discovered that physical exercise enhanced his scholarly work in unexpected ways. My recent research into the ethical implications of architectural choices has benefited significantly from the body awareness and stress management techniques you've taught me. I am finding that physical training serves as a form of applied philosophy, way of exploring human potential through direct experience rather than theoretical analysis. Grace smiled, remembering how intimidating Thomas's had seemed on their first day of training and how natural their friendship had become over months of shared challenges and discoveries. "You know what's funny, Thomas's? I started training you because I wanted to help you lift ceremonial stones, but you ended up teaching me more about training philosophy than I learned in all my years of fitness education." "How so?" "You showed me that the most important question isn't how strong can someone become, but how strong do they need to be for what matters most to them." Once I understood that distinction, everything about training changed. This insight had influenced not just Grace's professional practice, but her personal approach to challenges and goal setting. She had begun applying ceremonial training principles to her own life, focusing on developing capabilities that served her relationships and community rather than pursuing fitness achievements that were disconnected from meaningful purpose. "Grace, Kim, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. I have been invited to present a paper on physical training as applied ethics at the Galactic Philosophy Conference next month. Would you be interested in co-presenting with me? I believe your practical insights would provide valuable balance to my theoretical analysis." Grace paused, considering the unexpected opportunity to share their discoveries with an academic audience that would never have considered the philosophical implications of personal training. "Thomas's, I would be honored. But I should warn you, I'm not sure I can explain our training methods using proper philosophical terminology." "Grace Kim, that is precisely why your perspective is essential. Academic philosophy often becomes disconnected from practical application. Your ability to translate complex ideas into actionable approaches could help bridge that gap." 2 months later, Grace found herself standing before an audience of philosophers, ethicists, and consciousness researchers from across the galaxy, explaining how a personal training session with an 847-year-old Kratarian had led to insights about the nature of human potential and the relationship between physical capability and meaningful purpose. "The most important thing we discovered," Grace told the assembled academics, "is that strength is not a fixed characteristic that people either have or lack. Strength is a dynamic quality that emerges when people are focused on serving something larger than their own comfort or convenience." She gestured to Thomas's, who was sitting in the front row wearing a conference badge that read, "Dr. Thomas's Stone Weaver, Professor of Applied Ethics, Kratarian University. My client didn't become stronger because we increased his muscle mass or improved his cardiovascular capacity, though we did both of those things. He became stronger because we helped him understand that his desire to bless his granddaughters' future was more powerful than his fear of failing publicly." The presentation was followed by questions from researchers who were intrigued by the practical applications of their findings. Grace found herself discussing training methodology with alien philosophers, explaining exercise physiology to consciousness researchers, and translating fitness concepts into ethical frameworks. But the most rewarding moment came during the conference reception, when a young Zephyrian graduate student approached her with a question that reminded Grace of her first conversation with Thomas's. "Grace Kim, I am preparing for my doctoral defense next month, but I have a problem. My research focuses on theoretical applications that I have never tested practically. How can I develop confidence in presenting ideas that exist only as academic concepts?" Grace looked at this nervous young researcher, seeing the same mixture of capability and self-doubt that had brought Thomas's to her gym 6 months earlier. "What's your research about?" "I am studying the practical applications of interspecies communication theory for improving galactic diplomatic protocols. But I have never actually participated in diplomatic negotiations, so I am uncertain whether my theoretical insights have real-world validity." Grace smiled, recognizing an opportunity to apply the training principles she had developed with Thomas's to an entirely different type of performance challenge. "Have you ever considered that your doctoral defense isn't really about proving that you know everything about diplomatic theory? It's about demonstrating your commitment to improving interspecies communication, because you believe better understanding between different cultures is important." The young Zephyrian's crystalline features shifted into an expression of surprised recognition. "You mean I should focus on serving the goal of improved communication rather than on impressing the examination committee?" "Exactly. When you're focused on contributing to something that matters more than your own academic success, you'll access capabilities you didn't know you had." As Grace walked home from the conference, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of training and human potential had evolved since the day Thomas's first shuffled into her gym. She had begun their work together, believing that her job was to make him stronger. Instead, she had discovered that her real job was to help him realize he was already stronger than he knew, and in teaching him to lift ceremonial stones, she had learned that the most important strength anyone could develop was the willingness to try, to grow, to serve others even when the outcome was uncertain. Sometimes the best training was just helping people remember that love made them capable of things they never thought possible.